Welcome you to today's RWG April meeting. Certainly glad to have you. One quick announcement. I want to remind folks, anyone interested in presenting, we do monthly meetings with the requirements working group. If you have interest in presenting, if you'd let me know, Kevin Orr, be found kevin.orr@incose.org. You can email me or Lou your interest in presenting. Without further ado, we're going to introduce our presenter, Adam Skrzpczak, but he's the lead MBSE chief engineer at STC, Strategic Technology Consulting, currently living in Rock Hill, South Carolina. He's originally from the New Jersey area where he worked at Picatinny Arsenal, New Jersey from 2012 to 2021 as a lead system engineer supporting munition developments, fusing systems, fire control, and weapon development. Started at STC in 2021, growing under the competency under Chief Engineer Ron Kane. He's worked several different domains for the Army, the Air Force, and Marine Corps, and commercial, gaining different experience across the spectrum of systems employed there. So today he's going to talk on how STC is updating the object-oriented system engineering model, OOSEM, in related to the integrated set of needs. So I will hand it over to you, Adam.
Thank you for the introduction, Kevin. My name is Adam Skrzpczak, and as Kevin mentioned, I'm the lead MBSE Chief Engineer for STC. I'm going to run through an update to our implementation of the OSEM, leveraging the work done by the INCOSE RWG, as detailed in the Needs and Requirements Manual, and the other corresponding documents with that, like the Guide to Writing Requirements and the Guide to Needs and Requirements as well. So to start, just a brief overview of the agenda, and like Kevin mentioned, I'll take some breaks for questions, and I'll read through the chat as well if folks have questions in there as well. So basically, an overview of the changes that we made, kind of what drove the changes, the approach we took, looking at implementing the changes, and kind of a brief dip into the conceptual review of the things that I really appreciated from the lifecycle and needs definition activities that was in the Needs and Requirements Manual, and then getting into some of the actual specifics of the updated method that we've applied here at STC. Basically, the walkthrough of the updated process and the activities within that. And then part 3, kind of an overview of the profile and some examples. And then lastly, is kind of wrapping up with some discussion on path forward. So how these discussions that we have are helping influence the future of the OSEM and within System LV2. So for those who may or may not know, this is the object-oriented system engineering method, intended for the use for model-based system engineering. It's originally kind of built around the idea of systems modeling language, SysML. It's documented in a couple of places that you may be able to find it. One is a practical guide to SysML, and the other place is on INCOSE's OSEM working group, which has a process reference for people to go to. And the area we'll focus on is mainly changes within analyzed stakeholder needs. Within the method, this is where stakeholders are identified, needs collected, use cases are generated, measures of effectiveness are identified, and the problem space of the system engineering effort is specified. Jumping into a change, one of the main issues that we ran into with OOSEM, with the object-oriented system engineering method, is around the ideas of mission requirements. If you guys are familiar with that, within the object-oriented system engineering method, generally you do these steps for analyzing stakeholder needs. And within there, they have these discussions around mission requirements as part of that, and in conducting a mission requirements review. And that induced some confusion and issues on a lot of our projects at STC. So that was one thing. On STC projects, we had a great deal of negative experiences dealing with deconflicting and integrating needs from multiple stakeholders and source artifacts. So oftentimes we had a lot of different sources of truth to pull together in various levels of refinement. Another issue with the source documents, that was actually a bigger driver where we had to deal with that. Like oftentimes projects would get multiple starting documents, ICDs, legacy system specifications. Obviously, any performance specifications are provided by the acquirer. Also, any kind of other needs that may have been enlisted in those discussions and things like that as reviews occur. And it becomes this kind of haphazard mess of just trying to like bring everything together and then create your supplier set of requirements or your design input requirements. So it's that, the distinguishing of what mission requirements are from system requirements within OOSEM, the distinguishing of stakeholder requirements from the system requirements themselves. That's a big part of a lot of the writing in the needs and requirements manual. Also distinguishing terms like needs and concerns. Oftentimes people use those terms interchangeably, and we generally feel that they have different roles, but they have some kind of relation between them. Also dealing with the incorporation of stakeholder requirements that aren't well formed. Oftentimes a lot of custom requirements we get aren't the best. They're not usually formatted with the attributes that a well-formed requirement statement would need to have, and they require a lot of refinement, a lot of kind of analysis to really just get an understanding of, well, what's the stakeholder really looking for here? Especially true when you're kind of building a lot of these brownfield system cases where there's like a lot of existing requirement documents around the system that you kind of have to like ingest and like analyze to develop your system specification. But lastly is also this concept of system validation. Verification of the system is very important. Often enough, when we develop these system models using OOSEM, we don't really have a clear idea of what success looks like from the perspective of the acquirer. So it makes it really difficult to really understand, well, what requirements are important, what's tradable, how do we navigate that space, and also really understand kind of, well, what do they really need at the end of the day? And that drives things like your measures of effectiveness, that drives things like, obviously, like those validation concepts. And like we were really lacking on a good approach to develop that. So about a year ago led to a major struggle session with kind of with some of our customers on like the mission requirements piece and all that. And that kind of drove me to take the lead to be investigating, well, how do we improve this and incorporate the improvements into our implementation of the OSEM? So we approached the change. First we tried to kind of figure out, within the OSEM, what we're trying to get at with mission requirements. We read through the texts, we read through, obviously the practical guides to SysML, which covers a lot of the OSEM. We read through the INCOSE websites, process implementation of that, and other sources to really try to identify that in a consistent manner. That led us to kind of see some potential inconsistencies in some terminology that arose. So obviously within 15288, there's discussions around what business and mission analysis is versus stakeholder needs and stakeholder requirements. And then lastly, that led us to the literature developed by the INCOSE RWG, basically looking at like, well, if the mission requirements are something else, then we probably need something more specific to stakeholder needs analysis that we'd like to incorporate. So that led us to the needs and requirements manual, the guide to writing requirements, and the guide to needs and requirements as well. So then we decided to incorporate these new approaches into our implementation of the OSEM. And I want to stress that, right? This is kind of our interpretation of these concepts into our implementation. They're not the way, I'm not going to speak out of turn for the USAM working group or the folks working there. And this is kind of like part of that discussion of improving that later. But we figured we would take a shot and improve our own implementation using that. So internal to STC, we formalized this through a change proposal. We tried to treat this like a process change proposal. We had our quality implementation chiefs. And these are folks that within our company are really responsible for enforcing language compliance, good modeling practices, things like that. So they have a lot of overview of a number of different projects and getting their feedback based on their experiences with projects that have poor quality outcomes. We also did some non-advocate reviews from project leads on current projects and things like that, and SMEs within our company to get more feedback on this approach. And then we've now released it to our company in its initial release, and eventually we're going to be incorporating it as part of our quality management plan later for our models. We're already getting some early feedback on it and some initial success with it. I'll discuss later towards the end. So what are mission requirements? I kind of wanted to bring this here in case you guys were curious. So obviously the practical guide to SysML defines them as these prioritized sets of requirements that are defined to address the limitations of the as-is domain. So if there's a brownfield case where your system exists in a existing context or has to interact with existing systems, the mission requirements help that. So one of the key authors here is Sandy Friedenthal. He was one of the contributing authors to the practical guide to SysML, but also he wrote Architecting Spacecraft with SysML, and that offers another definition for mission requirements as source mission requirements provided by the sponsor, which in this case could be the contracting organization. So that would imply that maybe the sponsor is your acquirer, someone that wants to acquire the system and do that. The way mission requirements, if you guys look at a practical guide or look at some of the examples within Chapter 17 of the OSEM, the way many of the mission requirements are stated or shown is kind of from the subject of the system, so like the system shall. And that was kind of one of the roots of our confusion was like, well, we have one set of requirements that say the system shall, but then we've got the system requirements that say the system shall. So like, what's the difference? Talking to Sandy after the fact, so we've been having these discussions in the USAM V2 working group. So for you guys to know is that the intent of mission requirements was actually to apply to the enterprise entity. And that's within OOSEM. If you guys know the method well enough, the enterprise entity is responsible for the design and definition of the system of interest. It's the holder of the measures of effectiveness and acts a little bit like a proxy for the acquirer. Basically kind of is the holder of their needs, their expectations on the system, and responsible for kind of managing the contributors to those measures of effectiveness, the needs, and the system of interest itself. If you're curious, that's what actually mission requirements are. So really the subject of those requirements might be like the enterprise developing the system shall do that. But I think with the integrated set of needs and need statements are probably more appropriate there. The other issue we ran into, like I mentioned, 15288 mentions that there's a business and mission analysis process that is an input to stakeholder needs and requirements definition. So this ties into the work that the RWG developed, but basically that those are inputs to those stakeholder needs and those requirements definitions. So within OOSEM, having analyzed stakeholder needs and then having mission requirements in there proved to be a bit of a conflict there. So it was just another case to maybe move away to a different set of terms to describe what those requirements are, which led us to do that investigation to say, hey, like maybe this integrated set of needs can supplant what those mission requirements are within the OOSEM. This slide here is kind of like was used more internally to maybe clarify some of the approach. Within 29148, it wasn't really, at least for us, clear like how you would relate, say, a set of stakeholder requirements provided by an acquirer to a supplier. And if you just directly just transform them and turn them into your own set of system requirements and just build off of that. But we also kind of like the idea of having both the acquirer and supplier to run through this integrated set of needs process. Now, they may not always do that. I don't think all acquirers are adopting this kind of approach yet. I think it's relatively new, but basically you always get these customer-owned requirements, and you might still want to do your own lifecycle concepts and needs definitions process to develop your own integrated set of needs and start that to really help as an input to your own set of supplier system requirements. So when I use this slide, I kind of try to indicate that both acquirer and supplier probably should do the process, but I think after some discussion yesterday, maybe that may not be entirely accurate, but I felt it's useful because sometimes suppliers may actually have more insight into what the acquirer needs than the acquirer does. Oftentimes suppliers, deal with a lot of different customers, a lot of different acquirers, so they actually may know things that an acquirer may need that the acquirer themselves may not know. So it may make sense for them to do their own analysis to really understand what their customer is trying to get at as well. The other thing I liked about the incorporation of the lifecycle concept of these definition process is also handling of customer-owned requirements. One key thing that we often ran into with a lot of our modeling projects was modeling directly from customer-provided requirements and customer-owned requirements. And that often led to a lot of quality issues. If the requirements weren't very well formed, the model didn't make sense after a fact. Oftentimes, like you'll see requirements violate a lot of those common criteria for well-formed requirement statements. They're not necessary or they're not appropriate to the level. They may conflict with one another or they're just not clear. So modeling directly from that, in our experience, just always led to poor system models at the end of the day. So there needed to be some kind of mechanism to take those provided requirements, to analyze them, to really understand what they need to be, and also create a starting point for a good, high quality set of design input requirements to your system. So I use this kind of like this was kind of like a little bit of a meme here, but it's like you can't just do this. You can't just say, hey, I got your requirements and now they're my system requirements. You don't want to do that. You want to avoid that, do your analysis and make sure that you're creating that good quality set at the end of the day. So what does this mean for the OOSEM? One thing we often ran into as well is, well, who does OOSEM? Early on, a lot of folks were like, well, if my customer gave me all my requirements, I don't need to do OOSEM. I don't need to do use cases. I could just transform their requirements and just build a system model. My case would be that OOSEM applies both to someone who's supporting the acquirer and those supporting the supplier. So just like that previous slide, the acquirer can use OOSEM to talk to their customers. If you're a government organization and you're building an RFP, you're going to talk to your capability organizations. You're going to talk to those folks across your entire lifecycle support there and identify all their needs, identify all their inputs, what's critical to the mission, things like that. And you could use that to generate your own set of requirements, provide that to a supplier. They can do their own OOSEM, same thing. Identify the needs, identify the life cycles, make suggestions or what they perceive as improvements or add their own 2 cents there and kind of pick up the ball from there. So where that cutoff is between an acquirer project developing using OOSEM and a supplier project is really up to the acquirer. They could just stop at generating system requirements and don't model any further. They wouldn't make a logical architecture or physical architecture, etc. They could just provide that as a starting point to a supplier project and go from there. But it's really up to them and what they need to provide. And this is more the benefits of the approach. But like I said, I think with incorporating this like lifecycle needs and definition process and the integrated set of needs into the OOSEM really helps with defining what that successful acquisition looks like, forces you to really identify all the needs and expectations of all the customers and stakeholders across the entire lifecycle. That lifecycle identification piece is huge. And when we show some examples later, it's huge to just understand, hey, like there's just more to the system than the system in operation. There's the system in transport, there's a system undergoing maintenance, there's a system being supported by training, enabling systems. And there's a lot to consider across that entire life cycle that I think is very important to capture. It helps set the clear boundaries for the SOI, for the system of interest. It helps avoid scope creep later. If you've done a good job identifying life cycles and needs and all the stakeholders up front, then you're less likely to get a scope creep later when someone comes out of left field to give you some more needs a few years into a project or something like that. It prevents those poorly formed customer requirements from impeding those design efforts. So if you have bad customer requirements, you can turn them into better ones and really understand what they're getting at with that, but have a good quality set of supplier design input requirements. And ultimately, that just sums up to reducing technical debt. One issue that happens is if you're kind of fumble the starting point on a project with the stakeholder needs and that initial requirement analysis and the initial needs analysis is it kind of builds your project on unfirm ground. And that creates a lot of technical debt because you're always having to go back and add things that you might have missed and revisit those things, which have propagation across your project and cause a lot of those headaches down the line. One thing to mention, obviously, and I think this is kind of mentioned in the needs and requirements manual, projects and contracts kind of need to allow for this approach. Not all stakeholders want to see that. Some stakeholders, some customers, they want to see you meet their compliance requirements directly and show that path to it. And they have certain restrictions around that. And if that's the case, then you kind of have to work within those constraints. So this approach isn't a one size fits all. It's suggested, but hey, like you still have to work within the bounds of a contract that you have with a customer. So I did want to give engineers an out if that occurs so that they're not forced to do something that they don't want to do, but they're forced to do something that, they have to do. So with that, I'll take a quick pause. Well, I got one from Jeffrey Walker. How do you apply boundaries around requirements pertaining to the jobs an individual is trying to get done? How do you capture compliance-driven requirements and trace them back to policy, internal, external? Do you capture decisions and processes downstream from processes within service deliveries? I'm not quite sure what the question is trying to get at. So boundaries around requirements pertaining to the jobs that individuals are trying to get done. I don't really view it as requirements around people. Just, you're trying to apply the requirements to the subject or entity, which would be the system in this case. I think really from the needs perspective, you're trying to frame the different stakeholders' needs and their expectations on the system, and those stakeholders are going to be identified across your life cycle. Compliance-driven requirements would just be captured as needs. Oftentimes, the worst requirements you see are shall comply with MIL standard XXX whatever, which it doesn't really help because many of these MIL standards are hundreds of pages long and contain a lot of different requirements, a lot of information. So that would be better captured as a need, saying, hey, within my industry or within my domain, I've got these things you need to comply with. And that would be your starting point for your design input requirement analysis and definition. And then capture decisions within processes and downstream from the processes within service delivery. I think with that, you're just going to go through and capture basically that transformation of elicited and provided requirement artifacts or need artifacts and show that transformation and the rationale for why you went from one to the next.
Just a little bit more color to that last question. As I do more work with AI, we're basically relegating decision and judgment externally to machine, increasingly as agents. And so understanding what the requirements are around a job pertain to what should that person be doing, what should that agent be doing, what decisions are being relegated and outsourced to an agent, and then how do we know that that's actually working the way it should within the boundaries it should. It's just part of the whole AI revolution kind of stuff.
Oh, okay. I think if you're going to leverage AI, which you could, there's a lot of time savings. Our own AI solution that we use helps save us time by just even taking a bunch of different disparate documents and pulling and extracting information from it into the system model. And what's nice about that solution is it still has the tie back to the original source in the text. So you can read what the AI pulled and you can see where it pulled it from. And you can also just analyze that to see if it did a good job of actually translating that into something like a need or something like that. Yeah, that's probably part of the broader AI discussion, but we could definitely work that in here. It's really just a matter of you take something that a person does now and just maybe assign those tasks to the AI.
Jeffrey, correct me if I'm wrong. I think when you talk about jobs, you're talking about the approach of jobs to be done. And I equate that as to basically the use cases that people are trying to accomplish with the product. Is that true, Jeffrey?
The use cases are typically one or more sets of scenarios within a job that someone's trying to get done. So the jobs to be done, you're right, Lou, that's correct. And the reason for the question was really around boundary conditions. Should that person be doing those kinds of things? Are those his or her needs, Or is that something that's a machine's needs? Where does it bleed over into other types of jobs so we can get more understanding about how it's being done, where it's being done? From the standpoint of compliance, it depends on who you are, what you're working on, where you're doing it, and what kind of stuff you're working with, especially as it pertains to data, because of privacy, because of protections and all those kinds of things. The compliance can get very complicated, right?
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. Lou, this approach is also discussed in the handbook V5. Yes, that's also a good place to look at that as well. I'll plug the requirement working group documentation as much as I can. It's been incredibly valuable for us at STC. We reference it a lot. We like it a lot, and we appreciate the work. So that kind of establishes basically why we want to make the change to OOSEM and where we went with that, incorporating these processes developed by the requirement working group. Now the question was, well, how do we actually do it in a way that we can incorporate it into the actual OSEM? So our main focus was to keep within this analyze stakeholder needs activity. So within OSEM, you've got set up the model, analyze stakeholder needs, and then system requirements, logical architecture development, and so on. So we limited our focus to here. We didn't want to have a lot of knock-on impacts to other process steps. We also didn't want to change this top-level process too much from the baseline of what the INCOSE OSEM has. So we basically said, hey, if mission requirements were the area that we had a problem with, then that's what we're going to go update. So we turned specify mission requirements into define integrated set of needs, and then we did conduct a mission requirements review to validate the integrated set of needs. And that validation would include some of the follow-on products to that. So like the domain BDD, which is there to help establish, say, the context for the problem that you're trying to solve. Your enterprise use cases, which help cover some of the main goals and use cases of the system that you want to build. And also those measures of effectiveness or those objective measures of the system of goodness that would be important to that customer. So those are the main changes to this top level process. And then within define integrated set of needs, we created this updated kind of summation of what we thought was basically the lifecycle concepts and needs definitions process. So we covered the establishment of the problem, threat, and opportunity, like as a singular statement, the definition of the missions, goals, and objectives, identification of stakeholders, and then identifying the lifecycle concepts, eliciting needs from those stakeholders, analyzing and integrating all of that into a set, and then also planning for validation activities as well. One other thing we added here was also the capture of stakeholder concerns. And this goes back to that point I made about distinguishing needs from concerns. In this case, we wanted to keep concerns more relevant to things that the model as a project needs to provide in terms of information items. So, and that would be documented in views and viewpoints, and basically would reflect a wide variety of different concerns. And those concerns can be related to needs, and needs can be related to concerns. But those would also be things that would drive, say, certain decisions that need to be made about a project. There would be things that would also drive technical reviews. So your entry-exit criteria for technical review could be considered a concern. Things you'd like to see there before you move on, things like that. So we added that there because we felt it was a good place to do it. If you're already going to do all this work of identifying stakeholders and eliciting their needs, you might as well also start looking at building out your concerns as well and driving your views and viewpoints. Here we go with some of the lower level steps. So as I mentioned, establishing the problem, threat, opportunity. We tried to keep this to be one statement. I think that's kind of what the NRM recommended. And basically to summarize it, right? So it's like, what is the why for this project? And summarize it and distinguish it between problems and threats and opportunities. What is it? There are often a lot of drivers for why, say, a new system may be required. So at some point, you look at something like if you're in the Air Force, like the F-16 versus F-35, at some point, there's a straw that kind of breaks the camel's back that's like, well, we need a whole new system. We can't just keep upgrading the old one. I think that is a good way to look at what that PTO can define. It's not going to capture every possible opportunity and every possible problem or every possible threat, but it could be like, this is the main thing that we need to address. And this is what's driving this new system acquisition. And all those other details can be captured later in other forms like the missions and goals and objectives, which is here on the right. And again, we want to make this a single mission statement that lays out the expected outcome of the project. And it's singular. There's only one there. And you only want one because if you have multiple mission statements, then you might have a project in conflict and it might not be focused. And we borrowed again from the NRM, like basically some of the how many goals you need and how many objectives. So like the goals further elaborate on that mission statement, add additional details and goals that the customer may want, but then also the objectives, which hopefully add those more quantitative and measurable objectives that might be important to that customer. And those could then later drive your MOEs if you want. Identifying stakeholders, we wanted to kind of just cover that in that one step. So basically identifying them, prioritizing them as needed. Not all stakeholders are created equal. Some have more impact on a project than others. And that prioritization of stakeholders can drive the prioritization of needs later. Eliciting their needs is important too. And here's where we want to capture a lot of those inputs. I think there's one nice chart within the NRM that shows all the inputs into an integrated set of needs: risk analysis, interface documents, as a system requirements, reference architectures, which are becoming more common now, all standards and all that. And then identifying the lifecycle concepts also covers, well, what is the life cycles of the system from the perspective of the customer? So there's a discussion there that needs to be had in terms of, well, how they view a system lifecycle within their domain. And that could be relevant to the military. Military has predefined life cycles that they capture, but there also may be important aspects within those life cycles that you'd like to consider as well. And it's kind of a bit recursive, but as you identify those life cycles, you may identify stakeholders you may not have talked to. So if you're talking about your maintenance life cycle portion, you may have to talk to maintainers and get their feedback and get their needs. So I really like that step. I really like incorporating that into the process because it really helps really kind of from the completeness perspective of creating that set of needs. And then lastly, we kind of round out with analyzing, integrating the needs into a set. Here, you're going to basically look at all your different needs. You're going to deconflict them. You're going to refine them, organize them into that cohesive and coherent set of needs. And you may categorize them by function, fit, form, quality, as recommended in the guide. And as you're working through this process, it's not like done in a vacuum. You're going to always be touching base with your different stakeholders to ensure that you're capturing things accurately. You're going to basically say, hey, we thought this stakeholder and this stakeholder had a very similar need, but this is kind of what we refined it as. Doing that early and often will make your later reviews a little bit easier because by that point, you should just be gaining agreement, not trying to fix the entire integrated set of needs. So keeping it recursive and keeping that line of communication back is important. In terms of responsibility for this integrated set of needs when you're done, I would allocate it to the enterprise block. So if you have an enterprise block within your system domain, that would be the holder of the stakeholder needs versus, say, the system. Because not all needs may also be necessarily relevant just to the system of interest, but may be relevant to other aspects of the project as well. So things like, hey, I need this in a few years is both a contractual and project concern, not just a system constraint on what parts you need by when or when the system needs to be ready by. And lastly, planning for system validation. Within the needs statements themselves, you could just leverage the inspect, analyze, test, demonstrate, and kind of create your validation strategy. So how would you validate these needs is very important to capture. And basically remember to answer that question of, did we build the right thing? And here, again, I touch on the stakeholder concerns bit. So information pertinent to decision makers, project deliverables, your procedurals could be captured as stakeholder concerns and drive certain views, standards compliance, technical review criteria. And those models, viewpoints, and views that you could develop and frame. Modeling tools like Cameo System Modeler have the ability to generate viewpoint and views. They have tools that allow you to generate those using Cameo Collaborator. Even if you don't have that, you could probably then go the route of just creating just diagrams that relate to those different concerns as well. So there are a number of different approaches you could take depending on your competency with the tool. And then lastly, these OOSEM next steps. Once you have this integrated set of needs complete, it should make it easier now for you to define your domain BDD, your use cases, and your MOE that you have for your enterprise and that your system contributes to. So your domain BDD is useful for capturing not just what your system of interest is, but what it interacts with and contextualizing it. And those use cases help define those goals that a user wants to accomplish, which helps then support a behavioral analysis later and analyze system requirements that will allow you to identify those system behaviors and then your system functional performance requirements as well. So that's how we tried to incorporate that. So with that, I'll take a pause on this section. I got two questions. So Stan asked, acquire is a new term for me, clarification. Within 15288, if you read the initial sections, they cover acquire and supplier. So acquire is someone or some organization trying to acquire a product or service or a system that provides service, and a supplier is someone who supplies it. So within that first section of 15288, there's a discussion around the agreement process. So within system engineering, there's a desire to ensure that there's alignment and agreement between the acquirer and what their expectations are and their needs are, and the supplier's ability to provide that to them. Some people call the acquirer the customer, but that's not always universally true. In like a military domain, the PM might be the acquirer because they're the ones actually putting things on RFP and actually, putting things on contract, but the customer might actually be the recipient of the end product. So the acquirer covers that. So even you have those additional stakeholders as well. And the suppliers just, could be a contractor or some organization supplying that capability. So there could be a chain of that.
That concept's really important in the definition, the guide to writing requirements for the design input requirements. Within the definition, we include the phrase agreement between. And so it's not just someone shoving a set of requirements down someone's throat. It's that there's an agreement between the acquirer and supplier when they sign off on the contract. And that set of requirements is part of that agreement.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, that's what a contract is. And BDD, yes, is a block definition diagram. In OSEM, you define your problem space using a block definition diagram, but it's basically the problem domain and includes the system and its external interfacing, interoperating, or enabling systems it may have a connection to. I think other modeling tools may have different names for that diagram, but that's just how I would define it. No, thanks, Lou, for that. It's definitely very important. I like to see more movement towards kind of things like this kind of approach of these needs modeling and kind of a precursor to those contract, like those RFPs where like the government or someone who wants to acquire might want to have those discussions with potential industry suppliers to help really understand their needs and have the suppliers understand their needs before issuing that contract as well. Oftentimes it's often the reverse. The RFP goes out, the requirements are already done, then you're kind of stuck with that. But I think, if there's ways to accommodate this approach, you might end up with better systems at the end of the day and less failed acquisitions. This section here, I'll just cover the profile we created. One thing to consider is SysML v1. I think in this case we're at v17, which is the last release before v2. Does not have any elements that really can capture needs directly. One way you could do is using the rationale comment, but that's a common element. It has a lot of limitations on what it could be annotated to and how it could be related to. So what we took was we basically said, hey, we'll create our profile, and this has some customization elements here. And we actually used the extended requirement for the needs statement because we felt it was probably the easiest way to approach it. And basically, instead of creating different needs statements for, say, like problem, threat, opportunity, mission, goals, objectives, we just made that an enumeration. So it's all basically a need statement, and these are just enumerations that you could select. You inherit things like priority, you inherit things like need type, you inherit things like the validate method and things like that. So you could reuse some of those relationships. We also did the validate relationship, which it's not shown here, but I think we just leveraged the verify relationship for that. So, we reused some of those things and just changed the names to be more clear. And then lastly, we added the lifecycle concept as a block, mainly as a holder. Made something is to help you basically capture what those lifecycle concepts are and relate to them. So what they may include, and if those lifecycle concepts may have additional parts to them that you might want to further refine as well. So that was our initial attempt at doing that. We also plan to have validation rules to support this profile. So simple rules like, you only have one mission statement. So if you have one element that has the mission statement enumeration selected, then you're only allowed to have one in your project. That way you don't have multiple mission statements, you don't have multiple problems or opportunity statements, things like that. So, and here we have some examples that we have. I borrowed some of these examples from the guides, needs, and requirements, but like here you have these opportunity statements, you've got the mission, goals, and objectives. You might have an elicited need from a particular stakeholder. You've got your lifecycle concepts defined in terms of what they're covering, and then you have validation, some kind of test context or validation method that you apply. So this presentation marks our first major update internally at STC to the OSEM implementation that we have. We plan on making a few others, basically based off our lessons learned, based on our projects to further refine that. We feel that the incorporation of this integrated set of needs, this lifecycle concepts and needs definitions process fits very well within the OSEM, and I'd like to kind of pursue that further. And it helps modernize the process a bit and keeps things like terminology consistent. It also really helps improve that understanding of perspective. So the acquire supplier perspective, like Lou mentioned, it's very important to understand that where you are in the project and what role you're playing. Different system engineers play different roles here. Right? So working for a government PM, supporting them, you might be supporting the acquire perspective, but working for a contractor, you may be supporting that supplier perspective and understanding that distinction. And like Lou mentioned, getting that agreement between acquirer and suppliers is very important, and understanding each other is important, but also having that common vision of success. I think that's the biggest thing we'd like to get to at the end of the day. That's something that's, I think, been a bit sorely missing within system engineering in general. Any other questions?
In Chapter 4 of the Needs and Requirements Manual, we talk about lifecycle concepts and needs definition. We have a section on there on drivers constraints and also a section on risk as part of gathering the information that feeds into the lifecycle concepts analysis and maturation activities. How do they fall within where you mapped out this? Is that part of elicitation?
With part of elicitation, I was thinking about trying to add that as well to that list of potential sources. In our documentation that we have internal here, we kind of cover all of those potential options. But I didn't want to include that as just a separate process step, even though risk identification and risk management is pretty important. We felt that was more of a project management kind of thing to do. But yes, it would be definitely a source of needs you could elicit from. So identifying basically the risks to the system, the risks to the acquisition that you're trying to track, that would help provide some of those additional needs.
It's one thing I found in working with stakeholders in some development teams, they kind of approach the project as it's an unbounded thing and we can kind of do whatever we want. And in reality, there are a lot of drivers' constraints, budget and schedule specifically, but also identifying the macro system you're a part and the fact that you have to live within that macro system, you have to operate within that, and that's going to be a source of interfaces.
Yeah.
So making sure that that is addressed, and it may not be addressed necessarily by the stakeholders that you're doing elicitation with. It's just a thought process of series of activities that the project team needs to go through. And from a risk management standpoint, there are risks associated with the project itself, but there's a lot of technical risk, like the maturity of the technology.
Yes.
And like for the FDA, they place a really big emphasis on risk and then how your product is going to mitigate those risks. So that feeds into your life cycle concept analysis and maturation as well as security, safety. It seems like it might be warranted to call those two out as separate from the elicitation. Just a recommendation.
Sure. Yeah, I can incorporate that. I think the FDA example is a good one because a lot of what they do when they evaluate things like pharmaceuticals versus, say, like preventatives like vaccines, there's a lot of emphasis on relative risk. So when you're injecting someone or someone's taking medication, they need to understand what that risk is relative to being a healthy person or being sick. So that's definitely very relevant, especially that domain. The other domain that we talk to when we discuss risk is also those dependencies. One key headache, right, I would say for defense acquisition as of late was the idea of concurrent development. And a lot of times we had systems where you'd be depending on a lot of technology maturity happening at the same time, and that imposes risks as well. So if you're depending on a system being in concurrent development with yours, that's also a risk you need to track and may have those alternatives and those needs identified. I think one good example of that from a military perspective was the Gerald R. Ford class carrier. Early on, they were concurrently building electromagnetic catapult launchers, but that was still an immature technology in line with everything else. But, that was a risk to depend on that because once you built the ship for that specific technology, you couldn't reverse course and go and add the traditional steam catapults back. So that's a big risk to track up front and to kind of ensure that you're understanding the dependency as well. So yeah, I'll add it to that. I think it's worth it. It's definitely a good thought process to employ. So I appreciate the suggestion. Any other questions? Sean asked, what relationship connects need statements to stakeholder requirements, derive requirement? Right now, we use the derive requirement between the two, but we offer the option of using a refine relationship as well. Technically speaking, a derive requirement should only be between two requirement elements in SysML, but we're able to get away with that because our need statement is a specialization or a kind of requirement. So I think that works fine. Derive requirement, you're deriving a requirement from a need, or you're deriving a need from a requirement. If you're going from a need to a requirement, I'd probably use a refine or a trace instead. But we haven't really fine-tuned our guidance on that, so we're kind of open to any kind of comments or thoughts on that. Just looking forward to SysML v2 and OOSM v2. I did want to put a plug in here. So I presented this presentation initially to those working groups, and this started a conversation to potentially incorporate a need element into SysML v2 and also incorporate this needs approach into the OSEM v2 as well. What that is going to look like may be a little bit different from what we have at STC, but we're happy to see it being incorporated nonetheless. So basically, there are two main groups to consider. So one's the OMG SMC user working group for SysML v2. These folks are responsible for establishing the pattern usage of elements and relationships in support of the OSEM v2. And then you have and that's led by Sandy Friedenthal. And then we've got the establishment of the OSM v2 activities group. So that's going to be the INCOSE OOSEM working group. And they're more focused on the harmonization of best practices, effective practices within INCOSE organizations, working groups. And that's shared by Ryan Noguchi. So they're kind of looking at it more from that holistic, activity perspective in a way that's not dependent on any specific language. So OOSEM v2 should apply to any particular modeling language. But there is that component of the System LV2 working group looking to create those patterns of relationships and elements for the OOSEM V2 as well. And as a bonus, you get to see the proposed need element. So we actually had a discussion with Lou and Jeff yesterday about this. There's discussion about adding a need element to System LV2 as distinct from requirements, discussions around refining stakeholder needs as requirements, capturing those well-formed need statements. And one thing they show here is the use of the weights and value properties, attributes to basically identify prioritization and criticality for these. And that would help define, say, like a trade space within a project, what's tradable, what's not, etc. There's some discussion there. It wouldn't make it in the System LV2.0, but maybe down the line in the System LV2.1, whatever that may be, it's good for that. With that, I'll pause if there's any questions.
You show stakeholder needs being built into SysML, but we have Doors, Polarium, Team Center Requirements Manager, a number of applications like that for capturing requirements.
Mm-hmm.
Are we replicating those then into SysML, or are we now proposing moving all of our requirements, statements, stakeholder needs into SysML?
That is depending on the organization and the project. And this came up yesterday during our discussion. Not all organizations have requirement management tools. Some organizations strictly just use the MBSE tool. If you have a requirement management tool, that's probably better to use because they have better requirement management, configuration management capabilities integrated into that. MBSE tools tend to be lacking in that regard. So when we created that need statement element, it's mainly for projects that don't leverage those requirement management tools. Now, I think to your first question, like if those tools do have things that would be used to capture needs and things like that, there are ways through like integrating a digital engineering environment that you can connect the captured needs in an RMT to your system model and reflect that and import them accordingly and vice versa. So there's a lot of ways you could solve that issue. So if you did want to continue using those existing tools, you're more than welcome to. And I think it's still important to consider using them on large projects where you have good configuration management on your requirement. But we incorporate that just for projects that are strictly just modeling in the MBSE tool itself and not leveraging those tools. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Adam.
Kevin, I saw you asked a question. Why start with needs when we always get requirement specification? You may experience situations during your career where you don't start with requirements, and two, those requirements should encapsulate the needs. When you create your operational scenarios, you may uncover those missing needs. And if you start with just a set of needs, then you can handle either situation. And I agree with that.
Jeff Williams has submitted that. I'm just logged in as Kevin.
That's a big thing. I agree with you. At STC, I kind of like to think that we're like farmers insurance, so we know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two, and I've seen all cases where you get a mixed mash of all kinds of stuff, legacy specifications, ICDs, all this stuff that you got to make something out of versus strictly customers providing their set of customer requirements that you got to trace back to and all that. And I think this approach helps with that. It really helps kind of give some clear guidance on what to do in those cases. I think I definitely agree with that. Okay, I got one from Jeffrey Walk. How do you incorporate measures and measurement into requirements both from a personalization customer? Measures, at least for System LV2, you can capture those as attributes and you can define those. So if you're using System LV1, you can define those as value properties and constraints. Within System LV2, the need or requirement elements themselves can have those attributes and measurements incorporated to them. You might have to elaborate on that question a little bit in terms of what you're trying to incorporate.
It's more of a ecosystem of how measurement fits in from the standpoint of different assets being used to deliver a service for a customer and making sure that they're delivering what they need in part and in whole for that point of delivery. And then, of course, each point is part of the journey that the customer's on and making sure that, yep, that's what they want at each step, how those things interact with the rest of the orientation of the systems.
Gotcha. Okay. Again, that's going to be a lot of your stakeholder needs elicitation, understanding your system boundary, understanding the systems that you're going to have to interact and interoperate with, and the expectations therein. So if you've got a brownfield condition, you're building your system model, your system in an environment where existing systems are there and present, you're constrained by their ability to deliver things to you and also the interfaces that they impose on you as well. So there's some constraints that come into play that you need to identify. And that starts with the needs approach and identifying what those are and to further identify kind of what that might be and what those limitations may be. I mean, for me, that's how I would start with. I would kind of look at what those systems are, the existing ones, and work off of that and see if they need to constrain our system of interest and how that works. So within Chapter 17 of Practical Guide, the example that they use for the OSEM covers some of this. And one of the things is to identify the contributors to your measures of effectiveness. Those contributors don't necessarily have to be your system of interest. It could also be the interoperating and interfacing and enabling systems your system interacts with. In that example, to briefly describe it, it's a security system installed in a home. And one aspect of providing security is going to be the response time for police and fire department units. So obviously your system of interest can't control the response time for police and fire. Picking up off of that, you can use the MOE as a means of understanding those different contributors to your measures of effectiveness or to the stakeholders' expectation of effectiveness. So
Thank you.
any other questions?
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned early in your presentation how as you take I'm just going to use the term customer input, where they have the customer requirements and all that in your contracts document. And then as you create I like to refer to it as my internal specification, because that's where I go through everything and actually try to create from that, like you have here on the supplier side, those system requirements by looking at all of those requirements and actual need statements if they're available, or interpreting needs based upon the analysis of the mission and the operations, and building what I like to refer to as my operational models and the like. I've been following that approach probably for the last 25 years. And I was surprised when I heard you mention that this is kind of a new approach. Now, I will admit that not always on the acquirer side, especially during the early part of that 25 years, did they always understand what was transpiring. I was just surprised to hear that you saw that as something as a recent activity.
I think more from when I said recent, it was more of like from the lifecycle concepts and needs definition approach and having that integrated set of needs. I think traditionally what we've been used to is more of the above. You get your requirements and you may have your internal requirements that you have. And you maybe SRR review them with your customer to say, hey, these are our system requirements that we report back to you. And I think to me, the new thing is you're going to have your supplier set of design input requirements that you develop, but you should also do your own integrated set of needs as well, because there are needs that you need to account for that the acquirer hasn't. And as a supplier, you have needs, even simple things like you got to make a profit at the end of the day. And there's things you got to consider. There's things in terms of resources your company may have, you have to work within. So that was to me the new thing. Was like, hey, traditional SE would just have you go from stakeholder requirement to system requirement, but like doing that integrated set of needs approach really clarified it for me. So for me, it's new because it just clarified it.
Now, what I found that in doing that, I often uncover missing requirements that the customer didn't think about because they didn't do as thorough analysis of their mission as they should have.
Yes. Now we've been using this since February and we've been noticing that too. Doing this needs approach by kind of sitting there and consolidating and reviewing these existing documents, we have been identifying requirements that the customer just didn't have and bringing that to their attention. In one case, on one project for the Army, we've actually had them go back and update their initial capabilities document based on our findings because they missed a bunch of stuff. And part of that was from actually the lifecycle concept identification. Like, hey, like the system at this point in the lifecycle, you have no requirements, you have nothing covering it, but these are pretty important impacts on your design, on your acquisition. It definitely works. And we're seeing as we start applying it on projects, it's simplifying a lot of these discussions because you also have one set of needs now that you're reviewing with customers too.
And one thing that we push in the current working group is that needs and requirements definition is not an exercise in writing, it's an exercise in engineering, and that a well-formed set of needs and then the requirements transformed from them have this underlying analysis. I've been involved in a lot of different customers, acquirers. It was an exercise in writing when they developed their requirements. There may have been some informal analysis, but in general, a formal analysis that's advocated in the Needs and Requirements Manual was not performed. And so because of that informal part, and like Jeff says, there's going to be missing, conflicting, even the feasibility is an issue. You know, they don't really consider that as part of their analysis. So yeah, this approach is a lot better. The other thing is in our discussions, we talked about stakeholder requirements. Stakeholders communicate their expectations as both needs and requirements or in the form of use cases or whatever. The idea that those are elicited at the beginning of the project, there's a difference between elicited needs, elicited requirements that are inputs into the lifecycle concept and needs definition activities, whereas the integrated set of needs is a set of needs developed by the project team with underlying analysis. They took into consideration all those inputs, but there's a big distinction between that customer-owned set of requirements or the stakeholder needs and requirements from multiple stakeholders from the integrated set of needs. It represents a totally different thing that wasn't really done well in the past. To me, that's kind of a new concept from what's been done in the past.
Gotcha.
And I really like that list of things that you presented at the beginning, the common issues that you were finding in your work. I think everyone was having those same issues. And now you've addressed that well. And I'm really impressed with how you've attacked this whole thing.
Well, thank you. I couldn't have done without you guys. I mean, I'm kind of standing on your shoulders to kind of get to where we are here. I thought the guidance provided was invaluable, and it really did help me address some of these concerns and issues that we had that arose.
But that's what we all do. We all stand on each other's shoulders.
That's right.
It's a mutual learning experience for all of us.
Of course. I did have one thing I did want to mention. Now that we have brought this out, I get some common questions that I could relay back to you all. But basically, like the first is with the provision of customer-owned requirements, oftentimes contracts require you to address them. Hey, you need to show your traceability to these and whatnot. And that bottom part causes some heartache. So some folks are like, well, you're taking a requirement, you're turning it into a need, now you're turning it into a requirement. My response often is, I think it's fine to do that. I think if you've been provided a poor customer-owned requirement as a system engineer, especially as a system engineer who's the agent for the supplier, you do have not just a responsibility to do that analysis and treat that like a need and really understand it. And, thanks to things like, model-based system engineering, but even most requirement management tools allow you to show that transform from the customer requirement to your need to your requirement so that when the customer asks about it, you can point to that and say, hey, this is how we got here. And I think it's really the most important part. So I'm throwing that out there. I'm wondering if you guys agree or disagree with that, or if that's not
No, I think you're right on, because you remember when I first asked you about this slide, I talked about how we go do our mission analysis. We build our operational use cases. I can tell you many times that when I sat back and I talked to a customer, I said, have you looked at this from a use case perspective? And the response is simply, no. So I sit down and I break it down into a use case and begin to lay things out. And that use case may have several extends and includes in it as I work through that process, and you uncover things.
Mm-hmm.
Those are things that in order to meet their requirements, I'm recognizing that there are other needs that should have been identified, which would have fostered some additional requirements that we have to consider.
Agreed.
Having that, I think, is excellent. Now, I will admit that I have not always translated that into a specific, well-formulated need statement, but actually from those use cases and the analysis from that perspective derived what I thought were missing requirements. But it was based upon the need discovered in that analysis activity. And that's how I would communicate it to my customer. I'm getting to the point now where once I do that, and I should actually translate this into a need statement. And this comes back to how we as humans think. The pictures, the diagrams are great, but when you can take those and you can translate that into your natural language as to what this is telling you, and then derive your requirement from that, I become convinced that your natural intuitive understanding grows much greater, much faster.
100%.
I might add, from a completeness standpoint, like Jeff was talking about, I don't know how many have read the newly released Guide to System Security Needs and Requirements. They talk about addressing misuse cases and loss scenarios, and we can apply that to safety and security and resilience. Customers probably maybe not have thought of that, and the reason they're hiring a supplier is for the supplier to fill in the blanks the customer didn't address really. So I think there should be an expectation that the supplier is going to ask those questions back to the customer and drive needs that the customer didn't necessarily address within their set of requirements.
I really agree with that. And I think we run into that more in our day-to-day lives than we like to admit. I often use the example of hiring a contractor to do something in your house, and they're the ones that know this stuff better than you do, right? You may want something to be done, but they can give you some helpful suggestions and tips and things like that that may make the process better. There's that aspect of sometimes the supplier just might know a thing or two more than the acquirer does in some cases where that exchange is helpful. So I definitely agree with that.
open for other comments or questions. Well, hearing and seeing none. Appreciate the presentation, Adam. It's very good, very insightful. Appreciate you taking the time to present it to us.
No, I really appreciate the time. I'm really thankful for the work that you guys do, advancing the art of needs and requirements modeling and all the above. It's definitely really, really helpful. So,
And thank y'all all for your time. Have a wonderful evening or afternoon or morning.
yeah, thank you all for the time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Y'all have a good day.